For a long time, I thought immersion in games had a pretty direct relationship with realism. The scale of the world, the feeling that things keep happening even when you're not even looking at it. At least, that's what I believed. The reason I started questioning that idea wasn't a game, though. It was a duck. At the beginning of the 1953 cartoon, Duck Amuck, Daffy Duck enters the scene dressed as a musketeer. Sword in hand, and he walks forward dramatically until the background suddenly disappears. The world just stops. Daffy looks visibly uncomfortable and asks for someone to draw the scenery back, and someone does. Just not the same scenery. The world comes back wrong. Now standing somewhere completely different, Daffy complains for a moment, adjusts himself to the new setting, changes his outfit, and tries to continue as if nothing happened. From that point on, the cartoon starts fighting him. He's taken from snowy mountains to a jungle. Objects appear and disappear, and eventually he loses patience and starts arguing directly with the person drawing the cartoon. He's erased, redrawn, reintroduced, and thrown into situations that make less and less sense. And through all of this, something strange happens to me. At no point do I lose interest. If anything, I become more invested as the cartoon starts tearing itself apart, even when the screen is almost empty. The more the cartoon breaks, the more engaged I become with what's happening, which feels strange because, in theory, this should be the exact opposite of immersion. We usually talk about immersion as if it is something fragile, like a visual glitch, a technical limitation, or a detail that doesn't quite fit could suddenly remind you that none of this is real. But in Duck Amuck, everything falls apart, and that's not the moment where it stops working, it's the moment where it becomes interesting. Not only does the cartoon survive its own collapse, it somehow feels stronger because of it. And the more I thought about that, the harder it became to explain why. Because maybe immersion, especially in games, isn't really what we think it is. When people talk about immersion, they usually point to games trying to do the exact opposite of what Duck Amuck does. Worlds that don't break, or at least worlds that try very hard to hide where they break. Places where boundaries feel so distant that you stop thinking about them altogether. Sometimes that means huge landscapes stretching out towards the horizon. Other times it means systems layered on top of each other until the world starts feeling alive. Games like Red Dead Redemption 2 are often brought up because they can make even ordinary activities feel compelling. Riding a horse, setting up a camp, slowly moving through a town. Things that would sound boring if you described them out loud somehow become interesting when you're inside that world. Other people might point to freedom instead, the kind of freedom you find in Breath of the Wild, where the game constantly allows you to approach problems in ways that designers may not have specifically planned for. Or maybe immersion comes from detail. The reflections in Night City, the animations, the small environmental touches that make the place feel believable. When people praise immersion in games, they're usually talking about all of these things at once: the environments, the characters, the story, the mechanics, everything working together so that the world feels like a single coherent thing, like it exists independently of you. And I understand why, because hidden underneath most conversations about immersion is a fairly intuitive idea. More detail creates more immersion, more sound, more interaction, more realism. The closer a work gets to reality, the easier it becomes to disappear into it. At first glance, the explanation makes perfect sense. Someone might genuinely feel more immersed riding across the frontier in Red Dead Redemption 2 than walking through Skyrim, or more emotionally invested in Arthur Morgan's story than in something visually simple as Emily's Away. The comparison feels obvious. After all, a photograph feels more real than a drawing. A video feels more real than a photograph. A three-dimensional world feels more real than a two-dimensional one. But the more I looked at experiences that felt immersive to me, the less confident I became in that explanation. Because if immersion is really just a consequence of realism, complexity, and fidelity, then there are a lot of things that shouldn't work nearly as well as they do. Books shouldn't be able to compete with films. Simple games shouldn't be able to compete with complex ones. And a cartoon that spends 7 minutes destroying its own world definitely shouldn't be holding my attention as well. At some point, I realized I wasn't even sure what I meant when I used the word immersion. And that seems like a problem because if we're trying to explain what creates immersion, it might help to figure out what we are actually talking about in the first place. The first time I played Riven, I spent most of the time doing something that sounds incredibly boring when you describe it out loud. I click on things. That's basically the game. You click to move, you click to look around, you click to interact with objects, you click to solve puzzles, and compared to modern games, it's a surprisingly limited experience. The original version from 1997 isn't even fully three-dimensional. Most of what you're looking at are static images connected together. There are no sprawling systems running in the background, no complex AI schedules, no dynamic open world reaction to your presence. And yet, I never found myself questioning the world. I wanted to understand it. Every machine felt like it had a purpose. Every location felt connected to something larger. Every puzzle felt like a natural consequence of the places it exists in. Not because the game simulated every detail, but because it convinced me that those details existed somewhere beyond what I could see. And that's what I keep coming back to, because when the remake released in 2024, a lot changed. The world became fully three-dimensional. The interactions became more sophisticated. The technology improved dramatically, but the feeling itself didn't really change, at least not for me. I still found myself getting lost in the same places, asking the same questions, and trying to understand how this strange collection of islands actually worked. Which feels a little strange because if immersion is mostly a result of realism, fidelity, or technological complexity, shouldn't the difference be much bigger? Riven isn't the only thing that makes me wonder about that. A few hundred years before video games existed, Miguel de Cervantes wrote a book about a man who saw windmills and believed they were giants. Not giant-like, not similar to giants. Giants. To Don Quixote, there wasn't an interpretation, it was reality. When Sancho Panza tries to correct him, Quixote ignores completely and charges forward. The windmill throws him off his horse, breaks his lance, and proves beyond any reasonable doubt that it was in fact a windmill. And even then, he refuses to give up the belief. Instead, he changes the explanation. His imaginary enemy and evil sorcerer must have transformed the giant into a windmill at the last possible moment. To him, the world changes before the belief does, which is obviously dumb, but it's also strangely familiar. Because every time we read a book, watch a film, or play a game, we do something similar. Not to the same extent, hopefully, but we constantly fill gaps. We assume things exist beyond the frame. We accept abstractions as places. We treat a handful of rules as if they belong to an entire world, and most of the time, we don't even notice we are doing it. The strange part is that none of this seems to require realism, or at least not the kind of realism we usually talk about. A novel can do it with words. A game like Riven can do it with static images. A cartoon can do it while actively destroying its own setting. And that's where things start getting more and more confusing to me, because if all of these completely different experiences are capable of creating the same feeling, then maybe we've been looking in the wrong place the whole time. Around 1999, cognitive scientist Pierre Gander published a paper called Two Myths of Immersion in New Media. The paper challenged two ideas that feel almost obvious when we talk about immersion. The first one is that more sensory stimulation automatically creates more immersion. The second is that more interactivity automatically creates more immersion. And he calls these two statements as myths. Not that these things never matter, just that nobody has ever really demonstrated a simple relationship between them. More stimulation doesn't automatically mean more immersion, and more interactivity doesn't automatically mean more immersion as well. And if that's true, then a lot of assumptions suddenly become much harder to defend. Because what exactly was I feeling when I first played Riven? What makes a world feels real enough to care about? Why does a novel sometimes pull us in more effectively than any game? Why does a cartoon hold my attention while it destroys itself? And I think most importantly, why after decades of technological progress do we still struggle to explain one of the most common experiences people have with fiction? What exactly is immersion? It's possible that the problem isn't immersion itself. It might be the way we talk about it. Because immersion sounds like a simple word, but the more I look into it, the more I realize people use it to describe completely different experiences. Sometimes immersion just means focus, being so absorbed in something that you stop paying attention to everything else. It's the kind of feeling that you get while studying, doing something repetitive, or even playing a competitive game where your attention is constantly jumping between dozens of different tasks. In that sense, immersion doesn't really have anything to do with worlds at all. It's about concentration, about being fully engaged with whatever you're doing. But other times, when people talk about immersion, they seem to mean something entirely different. They're talking about the feeling of being somewhere, the feeling of a fictional world that has become a place. Not just something you're looking at, but something you are inhabiting, a space. And the problem is that those two experiences aren't necessarily the same thing. You can be completely focused on something without feeling transported anywhere. And you can feel deeply connected to a fictional world without being totally concentrated in every second. Yet, we often use the same word for both. And I know I'm probably simplifying things a little by splitting them up this way, but it does raise a question. When someone says the game is immersive, what exactly are they talking about? The world, the story, their emotional investment? How do you measure something that seems so obvious on the surface, yet becomes incredibly difficult to describe the moment you try to define it? The idea that immersion is a world, a place, or an illusion of presence is usually where my mind goes first. Those are the experiences that stick with me the most. The moments where a fictional place starts feeling strangely real, not because I literally believe it's real, but because I start treating it as if it matters. And if immersion is really about believing in a world, then any fracture in that belief should break it. A bug, an awkward animation, a technical limitation, an NPC repeating the same line over and over again, something that suddenly reminds you that all of this is artificial. Those moments should destroy immersion. At least that's what we would expect, but they don't always. The game Doki Doki Literature Club begins as a fairly ordinary visual novel. The interface is clean, the characters are consistent, the structure is familiar, you understand where you are, and most importantly, how you're supposed to interact with it. Then the game stops pretending. The fourth wall starts cracking and the structure becomes visible. And the interesting part isn't the horror itself, it's that by the time those changes happen, you've already invested enough in the world to react to them. What breaks isn't your immersion, it's your understanding of what that immersion was linked to. The relationship changes and the game asks a different question. It's not, is this world believable anymore? The question now is, are you still willing to engage with it now that you can see the whole structure? And sometimes the answer can be no. The problem is, the more I think about it, the less sense it makes. The explanation feels more and more incomplete. Take a magic trick, for example. Nobody actually believes the magician has broken the laws of physics. You don't leave the theater convinced that objects can disappear into thin air. And yet, it still works. Not because you believe it, but because for a moment, you're stuck somewhere between understanding and confusion. You know something isn't right, but you don't know how it's being done. And that uncertainty becomes part of the experience. It's not quite belief, and it's not exactly acceptance either. If immersion was purely a choice, then experiences like this wouldn't really make sense. Superliminal is one of the clearest examples I can think of. The central mechanic of the game is based on perspective. Pick up an object and move it closer to the camera, it becomes larger. You move it farther away and it becomes smaller. The entire game is built around a rule that obviously doesn't belong to the real world, and yet after a few minutes you stop questioning it. Not because the game convinced you that this is how perspective actually works, but because you've accepted that this is how this world works. And what's interesting is that Superliminal doesn't try very hard to hide how artificial it is. If anything, the game constantly draws attention to its own absurd. The structure is visible, the trick is visible, the rules are visible, and somehow none of that prevents immersion, and instead it's the whole reason the game works in the first place. Because you are forced to engage with those rules, whether you like them or not. You can't solve the puzzles by insisting the game should behave differently, and at some point you have to meet it on its own terms. And the more you think about that, you start seeing difference between someone like Don Quixote and Superliminal. When Quixote looks at a windmill, he isn't trying to understand what he's seeing, he's already decided. The windmills aren't similar to giants, they are giants. And when reality contradicts that belief, he doesn't question it, he changes the explanation instead. A sorcerer did it, problem solved. In one case, you're trying to understand a world that doesn't make sense yet. In the other, you've already decided what the world means. It's like sometimes you notice the structure, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you notice it and decide it doesn't matter. And somehow, all three can lead to the same result. You keep going, it's immersion. So, when does a work actually need to hide its machinery? And what happens when it doesn't? Maybe the more interesting question is, what kind of space allows those two things to coexist? A space where something can feel meaningful without ever becoming real. Because there are places where this transition is surprisingly easy to see. Theme parks, for example. Whenever you enter one, there are always little signals that you're crossing into a different kind of space. The entrance gate, the costumes, the queue. Small rituals that separate one experience from another. And they are not part of the fantasy itself, but they help establish the conditions of it. And sometimes that transition becomes even more obvious. Think about a haunted ride like those dark rides with ghosts and animatronics. Sit inside a small vehicle and travel through a carefully controlled environment. And the vehicle isn't just transportation. In a strange way, it's what makes the entire experience possible. You never stop sitting in it, even while everything around you is trying to convince you that you're somewhere else. And maybe that's exactly why it works. And objects like this appear everywhere. A doorway, a movie screen, a joystick. Things that don't fully belong to either side, not quite part of the fictional world and not quite part of reality also. They exist in somewhere in between, and games have them too. The difference is the transition is usually much quieter. There's no entrance gate, no ride vehicle, no obvious moment where you cross from one space to another. And because we don't really notice that transition happening, we often end up attaching the immersion to things that are easier to see. Graphics, realism, complexity, technology. Meanwhile, something much stranger is happening in the background. The button becomes an action, a rule becomes natural, and NPC repeating the same line every day somehow stops feeling strange. Even if you can't point to the exact moment it happened, and that's what makes all of this so difficult to explain. Some of the most artificial things imaginable pass by without resistance, while much smaller details can suddenly pull you out of the experience. And the difference between them probably isn't realism. We spend a lot of time trying to protect immersion, as if immersion depends on never looking at it directly, as if the experience only works for as long as the illusion remains intact. No bugs, no visible seams, no reminders that any of these was constructed by people. But almost none of the examples we've talked about actually work that way. Not the enormous worlds that try to hide their boundaries, not the static images of Riven, not the magic trick, not Don Quixote, not even Daffy Duck. None of them are perfect, and yet they all manage to create something that feels remarkably similar. Which makes me think immersion was never really about how convincing a world is, at least not entirely. It has more to do with your willingness to inhabit it, to treat its rules as meaningful, to fill in the gaps it leaves behind, to accept things that wouldn't make sense anywhere else, not because you've been tricked, but because you've decided they're worth engaging with. The most realistic experiences are often the most fragile, because they're constantly trying to maintain an illusion. The moment something breaks, you're reminded that the world is real, and maybe that's why some of the clearest examples of immersion comes from places where there isn't even an illusion left to protect. And if that's possible, maybe the most immersive world is simply the one you choose to not leave. Hello, it's Lilo Skeleton. This is the end of the video. My first video, not my first video in my life, but the first video of this channel. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe, leave a comment. I appreciate everyone. Take care, I love you. Bye.